I saw something on Instagram Reels yesterday that reminded me of an article I read 2 or 3 years ago that is now just so unbelievably relevant. When I read it back then, I didn't think about how much it would play into my life today in 2025, and I want to share it with you because there's important stuff in there. And I can't find the reel now, but basically it was asking, what is it about the people who fell so quickly for the mustache man that primed them for authoritarianism, right? What's the common denominator? Is there something in their personality, in their past, that makes them ripe for the picking when a dictator shows up on the scene? And I was like, oh, this reminds me of an article I read a couple of years ago, and I had to spend some time digging on the internet to find it because I couldn't remember where I had read it. It's actually from Canadian radio, so it's at cbc.ca. It's an article from October of 2022. And when I get into the study, you might understand why this was something that was of interest to me back then. The title is called Who's Drawn to Fascism? Post-War Study of Authoritarianism Makes a Comeback. After the Second World War, Theodor Adorno and a group of scholars wanted to understand why so many people were drawn to dictatorships. Their study, The Authoritarian Personality, was published in 1950 and is widely referenced today to understand the shifting politics of our own time. We see so many variations of right-wing populism, authoritarianism, neo-fascism around the globe that a book like this has gained unfortunately new relevance, said Peter E. Gordon, professor of history at Harvard University, who wrote the introduction to the new edition of The Authoritarian Personality, published on its 70th anniversary. The lead author of that study was Theodor Adorno, a German philosopher and leading member of the Frankfurt School of Social Theory and Critical Philosophy. His three co-authors were psychologist Elsie Frankel-Brunswick, who fled anti-Jewish persecution in both Poland and Austria in the 1930s, University of California psychology professor R. Nevitt Sanford, and PhD student Daniel Levinson, researcher in the psychology of ethnocentrism. These four individuals brought to their study a very deep concern about the future of democracy in Europe and also in America, according to Gordon. Whether something like fascism could persist or re-emerge was something that concerned them deeply. Adorno and Frankel-Brunswick were both directly affected by Nazi Germany's anti-Semitism. Adorno's father, for example, was brutalized by the Gestapo. Both scholars were living in exile in Southern California in the 40s, part of a community of German emigres living in and around a tiny neighborhood of Pacific Palisades. One writer dubbed the neighborhood the Weimar of the Pacific. Four scholars surveyed 2,000 people living in Southern California in 1945 and 46. He wanted to figure out how otherwise fairly normal individuals get drawn into radical right authoritarian movements, said Gordon, but he warned that the authoritarian personality is often misunderstood. It's not a study of what causes fascism. It's a study of what they call the potentially fascist individual, by which they mean they want to figure out what is it that makes someone susceptible to fascist propaganda. And I know this is a question that I and many other people have had as we have watched friends and loved ones, members of our churches and our neighborhoods get sucked into the cult of MAGA. To answer this question, they came up with a questionnaire to determine where participants fell along four different scales: the anti-Semitism scale, the ethnocentrism scale, the political economic conservatism scale, and the best-known F scale, or the test for fascism. The original F-scale questionnaire included 77 questions to test for a person's susceptibility to fascist propaganda. For example, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Or, the businessman and the manufacturer are much more important to society than the artist and the professor. A subset of the participants went through more in-depth interviews where they were basically psychoanalyzed to study what their beliefs were about the relationships between children and parents, children and authority figures, and how those relationships may have shaped their personalities. Where the study is going here is the idea that we need to recognize that this reliance upon authority, it goes deep. It goes very deep. When the nearly 1,000-page study was published in 1950, it rocked the academic world, but it soon fell out of favor. The authoritarian personality was seen as too dark, and also simply not relevant for the times. During the post-war economic boom, democratic optimism ran really high. The book became one of merely historical interest because the scale was plotting something that people thought belonged purely to the past. Right, they basically were like, oh no, fascism, that's over with. We don't need to examine the F scale because we're moving forward into this future of democracy for everybody. That's wild considering they were entering into the Cold War, but whatever. Back to the article. Donald Trump's entrance onto the political scene on June 16, 2015 was a turning point. That day, he descended a golden escalator at Trump Towers and declared, "The American dream is dead. I will bring it back," and announced he was running to be leader of the Republican Party and president of the United States. Matthew McWilliams was shocked by what he saw. I watched Trump come down and I listened to that speech and I said, that was an authoritarian speech. I've never heard anything like that in America. At the time, McWilliams wondered if Trump was activating authoritarians in his party. To find out, he conducted a poll of Republican primary voters and found that those with authoritarian leanings were much more likely to prefer Trump. McWilliams wrote an op-ed back then arguing that Trump appealed to people with authoritarian tendencies in the party. The article went viral. It also triggered a backlash and he received threats. This warning from the past: the institutions and the politics aren't responding to the threat because they still think it can't happen here. Ouch. I bet McWilliams saying, "I told you so," is cold comfort for him right now. Rather than that long list of 77 questions from the original F scale, today researchers ask between 4 and 8 questions. None of them are directly about politics. Do you know what they are about? Parenting. They're parenting questions. That's because the way we view how we interact with and raise children is directly correlated to our relationship with authority. You see now why this subject interests me so much as a non-authoritarian parent who does not believe in the concept of obedience, and I don't punish my children. I don't believe in the concept of artificial punishments at all. Without even looking at this research at all, I have for a very long time believed the thing that primes us for authoritarianism is raising our children with authoritarian tactics. Authoritarian parenting, where the parent is the boss and the child must unquestioningly obey, where good, obedient behavior in the child is valued more than critical, independent thought, where having well-behaved children is seen as far more important than anything else, requiring children to subjugate their own will, their own curiosity, their own intuition to obey adults. Evangelical parenting that primes our entire country to tip over into authoritarianism. The thing about the questions that are asked today is that they have nothing to do with politics at all, and that's what makes them so powerful. Because it isn't like, do you think we need a stronger leader or should we ignore the Constitution? Instead, they look at the different ideas people have about the way we raise children. They ask people to consider 4 sets of attributes in kids. Which do you value more in children, independence or respect for elders? Curiosity or good manners? Self-reliance or obedience? Being considerate or being well-behaved? Of course, most parents say that they value to some degree all 8 of those attributes. But what is interesting is when you force people to make a choice about what to prioritize. When people do prioritize, they are forced to make a choice, and the choices they make have an incredibly powerful relationship to their views on things like gay marriage, race, gender in society, and politics more broadly. According to scholars like Matthew McWilliams, in America today, about 25% of the population are non-authoritarian, about 35% are somewhere in the middle, and about 30 to 35% fall on the authoritarian end of the scale. That's a lot, y'all. Something that's really interesting is that back in 1992, there was pretty much an even split when you look at the authoritarian directions of the people who answered and what political party they affiliated with. By 2020, that had completely changed. Now, Democrats are far more likely to fall on the non-authoritarian end of the scale, and Republicans are far more likely to answer those questions in an authoritarian way. Again, in the past, Republicans were kind of evenly split. So, when I say that the Republican Party is now a party of fascism, they are the authoritarian parties. They're no longer the small government party. They're the party of social control. They're the party of the dictator Donald Trump. That seems to play out when you look at what kinds of people identify as Republicans. People who very much align with authoritarianism, are very much susceptible to fascist propaganda, are very much susceptible to authoritarianism. This is why I say that parenting children well in 2025 is a radical act. The way that we view children's relationship with adults and the kind of behavior we expect out of children absolutely shapes our entire worldview. It all comes back to how we treat kids, what we think about children as human beings in society. Evangelical parenting that has dehumanized and controlled children focused on obedience has primed this entire nation for the reality that we are living in 2025. So how do we get out of it?